Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Cody Cook, who has a BA and an MA in Biblical Studies from God's Bible School. He studied under God. Not really, that's just the name of the school. He's a regular contributor at the Libertarian Christian Institute. He's the author of a couple books, Fight the Powers, What the Bible Says About the Relationship Between Spiritual Forces and Human Governments, and the recently released The Anarchist Anabaptist. We give a little bit of backstory on that latter book at the beginning of the podcast. I came across this book just a couple months ago. A mutual friend sent me a pre-release copy and checked it out. And it is really good, really good. Really helps unpack these two terms, anarchism and Anabaptism, and shows a possible way in which these two ways of thinking can converge. So that's what we talk about in this podcast. We talk about anarchism, Anabaptism, governments, politics. We even talk about voting towards the end of this podcast, which that was interesting. I think you'll enjoy this episode if you are into political theology, libertarianism, anarchism, and all those fun things. And if you aren't into those things, at least you can learn a bit about them. So please welcome to the show, the one and only Cody Cook. Cody Cook, welcome to Theology in the Raw. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Real excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Have we interacted on social media? I feel like we have. I've seen you on social media before.
I've shared some of your stuff here and there, and I probably left a comment here and there. I don't know that we've had any like extended conversation or anything, but I've been following you for years. So yeah,
I appreciate that. Our mutual friend Doug sent me your book. Said, "Hey, you should check out this book," and I was like, "Thanks, Doug. I have no time to read another book right now." But of course, I let me just check it out or whatever. And this is a really, really good book, man. It sucked me in. In fact, there was nobody cares about this, but just, I don't know, for the sake of just being raw and honest, I was, me and my son were going, he skis and I snowboard, got up to the mountain. We're all ready to go. I look in my truck. I forgot my stuff. I've got my board, my boots, no helmet, no goggles, no gloves. I'm like, all right, looks like I'm going to be in the lodge all morning and with my phone, which that's dumb. But I had your book on my phone, or the PDF or whatever. So I sat there for a couple hours and had time to read through it. And I was like, man, this is so good, especially since the title is provocative, the Anarchist Anabaptist. We're going to get into that. We're going to unpack what those two terms mean and what they don't mean. But why don't you share your story a bit? You share a little bit of the book, and I was really just sucked into your own personal journey. So why don't you tell us about that journey?
Sure thing. And first of all, I want to say I'm sorry you didn't get to ski and snowboard with your son, but I think it could have been Providence that happened that way.
Could have been worse. Yeah.
So there is a small section where I talk about myself a little bit, which I always feel a little weird doing that. But basically, I kind of wanted to make some connections to kind of how where I come into anarchism and where I come into Anabaptism. And so, as a teenager, I guess I became an atheist at a pretty young age. I'd say before I was 11 or 12. But not long after that, I sort of found my way into this general anti-authoritarianism. And so I'd kind of bounce back and forth. Like sometimes I'd be the kind of a left-wing anti-authoritarian. Sometimes I'd kind of be more libertarian. I used to watch Alex Jones before he was really on the radar. And I even I made a kind of, documentaries. And I even got one posted on his website. So that's kind of my sort of a somewhat embarrassing claim to fame, is that he shared one of my documentaries I made in high school.
You don't sound like a Alex Jones fan now, or
not so much. I mean, everybody has, I guess, something interesting to say, but not big. Yeah. Once he starts talking about lizard people, especially, he loses me. Kind of bouncing back and forth, that kind of left wing, right wing. One thing, I had a friend, we would find out when our local police are doing drug checkpoints, and we'd show up and read the Fourth Amendment and tell them they weren't allowed to do that. Wow. I had one occasion that was kind of interesting where after we left one of those, we had a cop just kind of as we're driving out, just kind of shoot up really fast behind us and pulled my friend over and kind of had him go talk to him somewhere else. And I looked at my other friend and I'm like, this is like Mississippi burning. What's going on here? And he gave my friend a ticket for stopping 6 inches beyond the line. Oh, wow. So it was there was this kind of weird thing where they knew about us and didn't like us, and we antagonized them, and they tried to antagonize us. So that was kind of it took a while to get back into Christianity, though, because I sort of spent this time in this kind of vague anti-authoritarian space. And how I get back into Christianity is a little bit complicated, but it's different things. I had a friend who was a Seventh-day Adventist, and eternal conscious torment had been kind of an issue for me. And sort of talking to him and finding out that there was another way of looking at it and that it actually kind of lines up with the Bible was one of the things that helped me get in a little bit. The other thing was it's that kind of when that spirit kind of speaks to you, and you, especially, at least for me, I wanted to ignore it. I sort of said, I remember praying, leave me alone so I can be an atheist. But over time, you kind of, at least for me, I was kind of dragged in, whether I wanted to be there or not. But I think because I had such a skepticism about authority and things that I had been taught in church, I didn't take anything for granted. So I kind of, when I came into Christianity, I wasn't sure if Jesus was divine. I didn't know the Trinity and stuff. Like I remember reading like Jehovah's Witnesses resources and going, well, this kind of makes sense. And, but then over time you read the Bible and you go, no, it doesn't really make sense. And so I by the time I went to Bible college, which was like, I kind of had this personality type where I really dig into things when I'm interested in them. So I'm like, I guess I got to go to Bible college so I can really figure this thing out. By the time I was in Bible college, I was a Binitarian, but not a Trinitarian. But then my second semester, I took a class on the book of Acts, and working through the book of Acts with a commentary, I was like, no, I guess I'm Trinitarian. So, I think about that Chesterton quote a lot, like how when he was creating his own heresy, when he finally put all the finishing touches on it, he found out that it was orthodoxy. And that's kind of where I am, unless of course you consider pacifism and annihilationist views on hell to be heresy, in which case maybe not.
Depends on who you talk to.
Yeah. But I would consider myself orthodox at the very least.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were maybe you wouldn't say this, I don't know, but like you were a very thoughtful person, even from a kid. Like you're thinking deeply, reading deeply, and yeah.
I think so. Yeah, I'd say that. Yeah, I mean, the stuff that I like to read, like in high school, like I said, I'd bounce back and forth a little bit. So it'd be like I'd watch this kind of right wing libertarianish Alex Jones stuff, and then I'd like read a book by like Bobby Seale or Abby Hoffman, who like started the Black Panthers and like the Yippies. And so like I like grew my hair long and started smoking marijuana because I felt like that was like a 60s kind of, it was like I was in the wrong decade, but I felt like this was a way for me to establish myself as an outsider. So I think there was somebody who had said, I can't remember who it was, that he only smoked marijuana for political reasons, and that was me. So anyway,
that's awesome. So okay, what led you? Give us a little bit of backstory on, I guess, the book, but how you came to the kind of views that you now hold, which anarchist Anabaptism, which is a phrase I don't see too often. I don't know if I've ever seen it. I'm sure some people maybe never seen those two phrases together. But what led you to kind of correlate your Christian faith with your kind of political viewpoints?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so I mean, as I'm in Bible college and I'm doing a lot of reading outside and studying, I keep, especially read about church history, you come across these kind of weirdos and during the Reformation period called the Anabaptists. And being someone who was kind of anti-authoritarian, I was like, I kind of like these people better than Luther and Calvin. Like, Luther and Calvin were, jailing people and working with the state. And these people were kind of didn't want anything to do with it. They were nonviolent. And so it's just, I think there was sort of an appeal there. I wasn't totally maybe on the pacifism train at that point, but I was interested in it. So I kind of always, I kept coming back to the Anabaptists because they were just such, I think, an interesting model of, so I'd like to say that the Protestant reformers said, we're going to go back to the Bible, sola scriptura. And then they got in a truck and they drove back to Augustine and they said, that's good enough. That's far enough. and I feel like the Anabaptists sort of said, no, we got to keep going. And so they sort of settled, especially like around the Sermon on the Mount. And they said, this is how Jesus tells us to live. And maybe this is how we should live. And where we see with a lot of the Protestant Reformation, and to some extent, Anabaptists could be considered Protestant, but they're also different. They're kind of outsiders. But the Protestants had this real tendency, I think, to look at like the Sermon on the Mount and say, well, there's some reason why we can't keep it. So maybe it's a model for how we should live ideally, but we can't live there because we're fallen. And so that's like one way to deal with it. So we don't really have to deal with it. Another way is like this kind of hyper dispensationalist viewpoint that says, well, this is how we'll live in the millennium, but it's not going to be how we live now. And then Luther does this kind of weird, I don't know if this is ableist to say, but like a schizophrenic sort of thing, where he sort of says, well, insofar as we are Christians, we can't be taking up the sword, but there's another, almost like a second person in us that can, because that person is a citizen. And so as citizens, we can kill, and as citizens, we can pillage and rob, but we can't actually do that as Christians. And so I feel like the Anabaptists had this really kind of whole person idea here about how this was supposed to be approached. So that's like the Anabaptist side. And I think, those who are listening maybe can already hear a little bit of how that connects in a little bit with anarchism and libertarianism. Because the Anabaptists also wanted to have nothing to do with the state. That was just a totally separate domain, the violence of the state. They even sort of said, yeah, sure, the magistrate serves the purposes of God in some way, but that's not something that we as Christians participate in. The magistrate is, for all intents and purposes, is a pagan, right? Whereas Christians, the kingdom of God is a different thing.
So the difference between like Luther and Calvin versus the Anabaptists would be, and maybe these might not be the best terms, but Anabaptists would stress just a very strong separation between church and state, where Luther and Calvin, they're kind of, I wouldn't say proto-Christian nationalists necessarily, but they're sort of integrating the two. The state can be used for good, whereas Anabaptists would kind of see the state as kind of intrinsically in opposition to the kingdom of God. Would that be, or?
Yeah, that's fair. Or I think Menno Simons, uses the term outside of the perfection of Christ.
Okay. Oh,
interesting. And Calvin and Luther do it a little bit differently. Calvin's approach is a little more integrated. I've thought about doing this sort of model of like comparing it to Christology, like the different substances or whatever.
Yeah.
So like, would that be, what is it where they're combined? Is that Eutychianism?
I used to know. You should ask me 25 years ago.
Sorry. So Calvin's approach, it's kind of hard to separate them totally. Luther does this thing where you can separate them. They're different. But as a human being, we kind of have those two parts in us, and they're divided without confusing the essences.
It's like the two kingdoms, right? Like we're in our personal life in the kingdom of God, turn the other cheek. As a citizen in, whatever country you're living in, we have state responsibilities where you can't turn the other cheek. Is that, I mean?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. And Luther sees us as having sort of a dual citizenship. Right. And Anabaptists talk about two kingdoms too, but they basically say, well, no, you have one citizenship. And so they're interested in, getting along peacefully with the state and obeying the laws insofar as it doesn't require you to disobey Jesus. But it's kind of like, if you go overseas, like if you were to visit, Saudi Arabia or something, you're not a Saudi Arabian, but you're going to try to mind your P's and Q's and get along and hopefully not get thrown in jail and obey the laws as well as you can, unless one of the laws requires you to betray your Christian calling. And that's how I think they sort of saw it, that we are part of this kingdom, not this kingdom.
Right. You're a sojourner and a foreigner living in a strange land.
Yeah. Exactly.
Wherever you are.
Yeah. So that's how, I think they approached it. I think as far as the kind of the anarchism thing, it's just over time that anti-authoritarianism, I think, had to become more consistent. And I found in libertarianism, these ideas of individual rights, of the non-aggression principle, which does not go as far as Anabaptism's pacifism. But the non-aggression principle is the idea that it's always wrong to initiate force. And so libertarian society would say, if you're collecting taxes by force, if you're throwing people in prison for smoking marijuana, which I mentioned marijuana a lot. I don't actually smoke marijuana anymore.
I see that joint in your hand.
Yeah. But that they would say that's just not reasonable for the state to be doing. And I mean, Anabaptists, incidentally, the early Anabaptists, I pull some sources from them. With a couple exceptions, almost everything that I found was fairly consistent with that. They almost have without really using the language, like a natural law approach to what the state is supposed to do. And so like Menno Simons rails against like war profiteering, right? And they talk about the state coming after, people who are peaceful, people who are Christians, people who are dissidents. And they say more or less like your job is to protect people from, thieves and murderers and, rapists and stuff like that. And that's very consistent with a libertarian non-aggression principle perspective.
Now, modern day Anabaptists, they wouldn't really be libertarian, right, in their political theology? I mean, but there's just a lot of uncanny overlap, or?
Yeah, so what I'm really doing is going back to the early Anabaptists. And
Okay.
yeah, I agree that the modern Anabaptists, there are some problems there. And so part of what I'm trying to do is I'm wanting libertarians and especially libertarian-leaning Christians to look at the Anabaptists as a model, because we've kind of ignored them. We sort of said, well, I'm Reformed or I'm Lutheran or whatever, and I'll sort of disown some of the old stuff and I'll tack on libertarianism to my religion. And what I'm sort of saying is there's actually a pretty good model for how to integrate these ideas in the Anabaptists. What you find today too often, unfortunately, is the very conservative, traditional Anabaptists, the Amish types. Generally speaking, Anabaptists are separatists. They don't really even vote usually. But like you might find some Amish getting in their horse and buggies and going to vote for Donald Trump, right? Or you might find those Mennonites down the road who, just kind of look like old hippies and, they're going to vote for Kamala Harris. And so I think, so you have a kind of separatist, this kind of, I think, rejection of state violence to some extent. But I think some inconsistency there where, and you see this a lot, I think, from progressive Christians, they're very quick to criticize the violence when it comes from the right, but they don't really want to acknowledge that the big pro-government giant state idea that they're advocating requires violence, because that's what the state is. It's really the only tool that the state has. And if it were anything else, it would be a voluntary organization or a social club. What makes it the state is the violence.
Interesting. That might explain why it seems like the Democratic Party has become kind of the new neocon. Like it's really interesting. Like, yeah. Even like, the Cheneys switching sides, whatever. It's like, people are like, what in the world? It's like, I'm like, actually, it makes sense, because at the end of the day, they seem to be more these days in bed with the military industrial complex. I mean, it's both sides really, but I mean, it's shocking how neocon sounding the current Democratic Party is. We should get to modern day politics in a bit, but I want to spend a bit of time unpacking anarchism, because that is going to be the red flag, the disturbing term, a misunderstood term. Now, fortunately, some people listening will have heard previous podcasts I've done on that with my friend Jay Newman. And I think I found at least one or two other Christian anarchist scholars, at least one, maybe just one. So we have unpacked this, but assuming nobody knows what that term means, maybe here's three things I want you to do. You could pick whatever order, maybe it's just woven together, like maybe a history of anarchism just as a concept. Then I would love for you to unpack like what isn't anarchism? Like what's the misunderstanding? And then you can maybe go into like, when you say anarchism, what are we talking about?
Excuse me. Yeah. I mean, a lot of movements defy simple explanations, and you would expect that people who call themselves anarchists might be like more so that way. But yeah, the short, basically definition of anarchism really is an etymological definition. It means without rulers. And so historically, anarchism has meant opposition to the state in particular, and in historically, traditionally, anything that's seen as an authoritarian hierarchy. So that opposition to hierarchy regularly manifested itself in what we would today call anarcho-communism. So it's a belief in the social ownership of property and the destruction of class distinctions, but without the state. And so you can see, I think, is it Bakunin, anarchist theorist, who argues with Marx and says, like, we agree on the communism, but you're not going to get there. You're not going to get to anarchism, or you're not going to get to this kind of society with the state. It's not going to happen, because you're going to appoint these people to try to make it happen, and they're going to take the power and they're going to hold on to it, and they're not going to give it up. And that was 100% exactly what happened.
Exactly what's happened every time Marxism has tried to be established. Yeah.
You got it. Yeah. So that's anarcho-communism. That's kind of a little bit more of a traditional kind of anarchism. And anarcho-communists also often were a little bit more comfortable with violence. Sometimes they call it the anarchy of the deed. And so, there's anarchy of the deed. I think that's what they call it. Something like that. The something of the deed. But it's not true that all forms of early secular anarchism supported communism. So there was a libertarian anarchism in the 19th century. So you have like Lysander Spooner. He's more amenable to free markets. not quite what you'd call like an anarcho-capitalist, but he's more in that direction. And then in the 20th century, you really do have anarcho-capitalism emerge. And anarcho-capitalists, they share that anarcho-communist rejection of the state monopoly on violence, but they argue that a non-coercive model of society is actually going to inevitably lead to private ownership of resources. And there's a certain logic to that. Like, if you get rid of the state, how are you going to get everybody to share? And it's like, well, some people are going to want to share, and some people will want to share a little bit, and some people won't want to share at all. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a certain logic to anarchism leading to something that looks more like a capitalist free market kind of society. And okay. So yeah, anarcho-capitalists, or ANCAPs as they're called, they love free markets. They like free trade amongst all peoples. They tend to be more pro-immigration. And they generally subscribe to what I referred to earlier, the non-aggression principle, which says that the initiation of force is always wrong, but, self and group defense is morally justifiable. So another thing to bring into the mix here is this tradition of Christian anarchism. Okay. And that has been largely pacifistic in character. And it has been a little bit less economically motivated, but it's probably a little bit more left-leaning traditionally. So you've got Leo Tolstoy, who's not really Orthodox, but he's an advocate of Christian anarchism.
Dorothy Is he not Day. Orthodox? I don't know much about him.
No, he didn't hold to the deity of Jesus. So if you read The Kingdom of God is Within You, there's some really good stuff on the state, and then he sort of does these weird rabbit trails about. And I think part of that, what you see in that Christian anarchist tradition, is they're so focused on ethics that they kind of leave behind the orthodoxy to some extent. They're okay. Like, the people who believe in violence also believe in the Nicene Creed, and that was established by Constantine, and so we reject that. So it's kind of unfortunate. But like Dorothy Day, who was a Catholic anarchist, Jacques Ellul, are other sort of examples of major figures within that movement. There's also a guy named Bernard Eller, who was an Anabaptist and used that term Christian anarchism for himself. Okay. I'll make one more distinction, then I'll shut up, which is there really are, I think, within Christian anarchism, two strains. So I call it an activist strain and a separatist strain. And traditionally, Anabaptists were more in that separatist strain. So they're saying, no king but Christ. If you guys want to have another king, that's fine. But we're just not really interested. We're going to kind of do our own thing and live our own life. They're not really trying to overturn anything. They're not interested in political involvement. They're just minding their business. So that's kind of one kind of anarchism. The other kind of anarchism is really trying to abolish the state and replace it with a more voluntary society. So that's kind of the other distinction that you could bring out there.
So does anarchy, I mean, when I hear anarchy, I just think anarchy in the streets, burning trash cans, chaos. All the bad people are running around unchecked. There's no cops to arrest criminals, and there's no judicial system. There's no government, and it's just absolute, apocalyptic. Is there? I mean, is that true? Is there? I mean, is that?
Not if you read anarchist philosophers. I mean, I think that's an assumption that comes from the idea that if you don't have an initiation of force, if you don't have a certain class of people called rulers who have the right to do what nobody else is allowed to do, which is to initiate force. I can't break into my neighbor's house and search through his stuff and put him in jail if he's got pot. But the state can. They have a certain right in theory that nobody else has. And so there's this idea that if you don't have a system of certain people on top who have these special privileges, then it will just descend into violence. And that, we'll have warlords and, it'll look pretty much, I guess, like it does now. So what I think there's a basis in, I think, a true observation that's there, which is that people are not necessarily always good. Right.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say. They kind of, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. But to me, that's also a very good reason to not trust the idea of giving certain people a special right to do whatever they want. Because if people aren't good, then so ultimately, I think what libertarian anarchism, and that's kind of the term that I use, that's kind of in that more kind of freedom of that kind of freedom tradition of anarchism, free markets and stuff like that. What I think we're noticing is that the more you centralize power, the more dangerous it is to life and liberty. But if you sort of push those choices down to the individual, ultimately what's going to happen is people are now responsible for themselves as individuals. And of course, especially coming from a Christian perspective, there's so much value in organizing as a community and helping each other and that kind of thing. But you get rid of the idea that there's a special class of people who can do whatever they want. And I don't think that means that everybody's out in the streets killing each other. Ultimately, I think that I see that as more of a trend. On the maybe on the extreme left than I do on an individualistic kind of perspective.
Mm-hmm. So you're, I feel like there's almost like there's the Christian anarchism and then just anarchism, and those seem to be two very big distinctions.
Yeah, because secular anarchism has not necessarily been anti-violent.
Right.
Yeah.
So in your just politically speaking, what does your political theology, your anarchism from a political lens, what would that look like? Would it be no government, no police, no whatever? Like what happens when somebody does kill somebody? Like what happens to that person? Is it mob violence that the people just take care of it?
Yeah, my position, at least kind of practically, is somewhere in that activist and separatist stream. So there's a part of me that sort of goes like, I would like the world to be a better place for my neighbors, but at the end of the day, like, I'm my kingdom affiliation is to the kingdom of God, and there's only so much you can do. But so there are different ways that if someone wants to be an activist anarchist, or especially a kind of libertarian anarchist, that you might approach some of these things. So anarcho-capitalists like Murray Rothbard, who I've got on my shirt.
Got a Murray Rothbard shirt.
So he makes a really interesting case in his book For a New Liberty that markets could actually handle these things, that people organizing sort of together nonviolently could take care of these problems. And so he imagines kind of a world of private law courts that sort of work together, so to kind of resolve some various disputes. There's also a sense in which the only thing that really would be illegal is something where there's a victim, because the purpose of punishment is not necessarily to be punitive, but it's to basically pay somebody back for something that's been taken from them. And so there's this sort of sense in which you are now having to, if you've wronged someone, you make it right. And so, courts and jails could sort of facilitate that process of making it right. So I'm personally a little bit skeptical of part of what Rothbard is trying to do there, in that I don't think that, I guess my starting assumption is not that everything should be privatized. And that's kind of his starting assumption. So we get rid of the public parts, we get rid of the public roads, Walmart buys the roads or whatever, and they manage them. And, they still have to be paid somehow, just like now. So it's not like a totally crazy idea. But like, I'm more inclined to be, I think, open to like a common law tradition. I'm more inclined to see, like, I think there's like some value in communities saying, we're going to maintain our local roads. We're going to set up local parks. I don't think that you have to necessarily, everything has to be owned privately. But I think his model of how to approach that is, once you really hear him explain it, and look at other theorists as well who've tried to make those arguments, like Walter Block, who's talked about roads. They make a much better case than you would expect coming from the outside. And I think when you're used to the state handling all these things, you feel like that's the only way to do it. There's kind of this old joke in libertarianism or whatever, that if the government started making all the shoes, 50 years from now, somebody would say, we can't privatize shoemaking. Who's going to make the shoes? But we just think that this is the only way to do it because it's what we're used to.
So there is a lot of trust in the free market, that the less government power, authority, if you peel that back, what will fill its place is people doing what the government feels like they're the only ones that can do it.
Yeah, because ultimately what the market does is it comes in and it meets needs. And so, if those needs were suddenly there, the market would rush in to fill those needs. Is the prevailing theory among anarcho-capitalists.
Now, what about, so like when I hear capitalism, and I'm not an economist, so please don't.
Well, neither am I. So take my words with a grain of salt.
Okay. Well, what the critique is that it's just the fuel for capitalism is greed, and people that get more and more stuff end up having more and more power, and it creates wealth gaps and all these things. Like, shouldn't we check the million and billionaires that are just having all the power? Now the response is, I think you've already hinted at it, and I very much agree. It's like, the state should hold it in check. I'm like, ooh, I don't know if I trust the state to be ones to do that.
The bigger the state is, the more that they're beholden. Basically, the more power that billionaires have to use it for their advantage. That's the other side. People confuse capitalism with corporatism, forgetting that capitalism is about free markets, not about markets buying the state and using it to their advantage, using that monopoly on violence to their advantage. But to speak a little bit more broadly to that question, I mentioned Dorothy Day earlier.
Mm-hmm.
She'd once said that everybody wants a revolution, but nobody wants to do the dishes. And what I get from that is that the ideal Christian society that we want to create requires a kind of selflessness and generosity that most people don't actually have. And that was something she experienced because she was kind of a little bit more of a left anarchist. And she had this vision of, I think this very progressive vision of what the church could do and, taking care of everyone who's poor and needy, and that it comes from this kind of voluntary spirit. But what she found is that people weren't necessarily motivated to do that. Even the people who she looked at as kind of her ideological, influences, they wanted to sit and talk and write and do that kind of thing, but they didn't want to do the dishes. And
interesting.
So what I see from that is that the best society is not actually one with the highest ideals. It's the society that can deliver the most benefits even when nobody wants to do the dishes.
Okay.
And so what kind of society is that? And what kind of society is it that can meet the needs and even wants and desires of the most amount of people without violence and without expecting everybody to be a saint? And that would be a free market society.
Okay. Is it Javier Milei down in is it Argentina?
Yeah.
The new president. He's a Rothbard disciple, anarcho-capitalist, and he's doing it, right? And from the little I've read, it's working. Or
depending on what you define working. Yeah, I mean, so if you're saying getting out of crippling debt and dealing with the inflation problem, I mean, a lot of what the situation Argentina has been in is because they've been so afraid to let things happen on their own. They've wanted the state to control everything. And so we're seeing, actually, hopefully we're not going to see it, but I think we are going to see it in California right now as they're wanting to rebuild. California is a very difficult place to build in because of all these government regulations. And so there's an economist named Brian Kaplan who just wrote a book, a very readable book. It's like kind of a graphic, not a novel, but like a kind of, comic type thing that really, that's on housing policy. And he makes the case that, if you want to be able to house the most people, house the poorest people, you have to actually get government out of the way. Because right now, if I want to go to Portland and build a tiny house community for the people who are sleeping on the streets and in tents on the side of the road, there's somebody there in the government to tell me you can't do that. And so it's like, we sort of live in this world where the poor are not taken care of, even though there are ways to take care of them. And so there can be something too, like how big a house has to be, how many rooms it has to have, how big the yard has to be. There's all these sort of regulations. And what that ultimately means is there's less housing. And because there's less housing, it's more expensive. And so if you're out on your own and trying to buy a starter home, maybe you and your wife or whatever, it's going to be a lot more expensive. And so this kind of government intervention doesn't help the poor. And I think what we're starting to see with Milei, he's even trying to get the state out of some of the housing stuff, and rents coming down. And so, I mean, it seems so simple that I think maybe people don't want to trust it. But the reality is that when you kind of free up people to help each other and to do things that they want to do and try to meet the needs of other people, you'll be really surprised about how well it works. You don't actually have to have a ruler on top dictating everything that's going to happen.
I guess it does seem to presuppose that people are more good than they're not, right?
Not necessarily. Yeah. I mean, what I'm saying is people don't want to do the dishes unless you pay them to do the dishes. but
Okay.
if you pay them to do the dishes, they'll do the dishes.
Yeah.
And so if you have a society where people, if I say I have a business idea, or even if I'm maybe being philanthropic, but even if I'm not being philanthropic, I'm going to build a bunch of tiny houses or a bunch of small homes for people in the community who can't afford the current houses that are on sale. And I'll make a little money. There's a market there that wants to buy it, and everybody is happy from it. I think that's the thing that we forget about markets. We talk about selfishness, and there is a selfish motivation. But what that selfish motivation amounts to is that when there's a transaction, I benefit and you benefit. I sell you the house that I don't want because I've made it and I want my money back. And you want to buy a house. So we both come out on top. And we can call that selfishness because it's not like I really, maybe if I'm trying to sell you the house, it's not like I really, care about your well-being, or maybe you don't even really care about my well-being. Maybe I want to sell it for as much as I can get and you want to buy it for as low as you can get. We're both being selfish, but we both come out on top. And so I think, even the left, I think, has kind of started to acknowledge, maybe not the radical left, but Obama made a number of speeches saying, yeah, of course we got to regulate stuff, but if you don't have markets, none of this works. And it's like, even the money that the state, that we want the state to sort of take and give to somebody else, that money has to be created. And what creates that wealth? It's the market. And so I think we really put ourselves in peril when we don't acknowledge what the market, what the power of the market is and what it does. We misunderstand it.
This episode is brought to you by MitoPure by Timeline. MitoPure is the only urolithium A supplement on the market that's clinically proven to target the effects of age-related cellular decline. So cellular health is the foundation of well-being and longevity, and MitoPure gives you a precise dose of the rare postbiotic urolithium A. It works by promoting an essential cellular cleanup process that clears out dysfunctional mitochondria, which is like your cell's battery packs. And with regular use, you'll see and feel the difference in the form of improved energy levels, better workouts, faster recovery, and more endurance and strength. So this is obviously super helpful for athletes. If you're in a sport, or you're a runner, cycler, or if you just want to, dominate the pickleball court, you want to check out MitoPure. For me, look, I'm 49 years old. I'm married with 4 kids. My competitive sports days are long gone. That ship has sailed. But I keep learning about how strength training is not just for athletes or people who just want to get jacked. Strength training is one of the most important things for energy, brain clarity, mental health, and overall healthy living. That's why I've been taking MitoPure for several months now. It really does help with this. So for Theology in the Raw listeners, Timeline is offering 10% off your first order of MitoPure if you just go to timeline.com/theology. Okay, that's timeline.com/theology. Go check it out. Hey friends, if Theology in the Raw has blessed or challenged you in any way, would you consider supporting the show through Patreon at patreon.com/theology in the raw? We are actually revamping our bonus material that Patreon supporters get. So we are going to 2 bonus Q&As per month for all the different paid levels. Silver level gets access to ask questions for the Q&A episode, and also you will get access to Exiles in Babylon archived content, which will be releasing different videos every month. Also access to bonus research episodes that I'm gonna record from time to time. Access to rough drafts of certain things I'm working on, which is a little scary for me to let people look into that because it's a rough draft. Gold and Gold Plus members get we have monthly Zoom chats and all the other perks that the other tiers get access to as well. So again, if you want to support the show, it really, really does help us to flourish as a ministry. Again, patreon.com/theology in the raw. I will see you in the community. Let's switch to Christian anarchy, because I mean, when it comes to like what's the best, like if the church didn't exist, what's the best political theory to run a nation? I'm like, I don't know. and part of me is like, I just thought of this as you're talking. Maybe this is a totally inaccurate assumption, but it made me think like, if just secular anarchy, anarcho-capitalism did work, the poor were fed, the rich were kept in check, blah blah blah, then it almost seems like the church would be irrelevant then. Like
Mm,
part of the political relevance of the church to embody the sharing of goods, other centeredness, generosity, all these things. Part of the political relevance as a political community is because the nations are Babylon, and there's
mm.
the other way is not good. That's just me thinking out loud, though. I mean, maybe that might say we need an hour long conversation to kind of tease that out.
I could give a short
Sure,
answer to that.
yeah,
I mean, so I'm not claiming that the markets can meet everyone's needs perfectly. And in particular, I mean, when you look among the homeless, not everybody is homeless because they can't afford a house. You have issues with mental illness. You have issues with drug abuse. And so there's always going to be a need for people to take care of each other, even if markets can do most of it really well. There is, I think, this sort of concern. I mean, we see this a little bit where this kind of loneliness epidemic, because people don't necessarily have to leave the house and they can do everything on social media and they can play video games and look at pornography. And they find that they're that kind of thing that used to get them out of the house, because really it's a lot harder to get amongst people and build these relationships than it is to do it on social media and to watch pornography. And so there is like a certain, I think, concern that sometimes needs can be met so well that we sort of forget what it means to be human, that all these things that we have created to these social safety nets and networks of support and friendship communities that I think really meet our spiritual needs in a lot of ways are not necessarily going to be met by the market. So I think that's a fair concern.
okay.
I think on the other hand, though, what we've, I think, seen maybe a little bit more is that the state has jumped in to try to resolve some of these things in such a way that we used to have voluntary support networks. The church is still involved in a lot of things like that, but not as nearly as much as it used to be, because we've sort of said, well, it's the state's job. And so, instead of going to your local church or your local Elks Lodge or whatever to ask for help, you go to the welfare office or you sign up for health insurance through a kind of a nameless, faceless company. And so, I think there are, I think that no matter what, there's still a role for the church. But yeah, I think there'd be more of a role for the church in this current day and age if we got the state out of some
Yeah.
of those things. But I think the market would fill a lot of it. But yeah, that is, I think maybe, like you said, we could go into that much bigger
Yeah.
conversation in the sense of, do the markets meet our needs too well that
Yeah.
we forget to be human?
It seems like, so let's move now to Christian anarchism, because it
Mhm.
seems like when I think of Christian anarchism, it's really a quite different thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, my mind just went in so many different directions right there.
Yeah.
Give us a definition of Christian anarchism as you would see it, or maybe kind of various options, and then maybe explain what that is and isn't.
Yeah. I mean, so secular anarchism, kind of that early anarchism, tended to be generally anti-religious. So like they would say no kings, including Christ. A
Okay.
Christian anarchist would say no kings but Christ.
Right.
And like I said, there's some differences. Some of them are more activistic and some are more separatistic. So that kind of depends on how much they're trying to, change the actual, secular order. Um, but I think one thing that really distinguishes Christian anarchism in that traditional sense of Christian anarchism is its nonviolence. And so,
Okay.
I mean, I have friends who are Christians and are anarchists, but they didn't come in through the Christian anarchism gate.
Okay.
They came in through the Rothbard gate, and they brought their Christianity or their Calvinism or their Lutheranism or their Methodism with them.
Hmm.
And so they don't really tend to necessarily see violence the way that I do. But I kind of came in through that Anabaptist and Christian anarchism gate, and so my nonviolence came with me.
Hmm.
But I think today I would sort of distinguish between a Christian who's an anarchist and a Christian anarchist,
Okay.
largely because of that view on violence.
Okay. So yeah. So give us a definition. It's without rulers. A Christian who is without rulers. What does that mean? Is it primarily a Christian posture toward the state?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, so again, okay. So here's the first two things. I guess I would, if I were to define it, maybe kind of in three steps. The first two things I think we would kind of all agree on, and the third thing is maybe a little more complicated. The first thing is that Christ is king. So if we're all Christians, we'd say check. The second thing is that we are allegiant to Christ as king. And we'd say, check. And the third thing is the kingdom of God is not a human kingdom which operates through violence, that you have human kingdoms operating one way and the kingdom of God operating another way. And this is partly why I find myself in the middle of the separationist approach and the activist approach. Because as an Anabaptist, I do think that violence is occasionally necessary from a secular point of view. That if you want to sort of have a secular order, I mean, the way the Anabaptists talked about it is essentially these pagans are going to have to police themselves, and that's the government is how they do it. So I'm not opposed to that in principle, so long as the what they're policing is like legitimately a crime. As Lysander Spooner, the anarchist, 19th century anarchist, said, vices are not crimes. So yeah, I don't want pagans policing, homosexuality or marijuana use. Keep coming back to marijuana, but I don't want them saying you can't build a house for somebody who wants one. I don't want them saying you can't braid African American hair unless you've gone to white cosmetology school. What I want them to do is basically limited to those things as far as protecting my neighbors from violence and theft and that kind of stuff. So like at the same time, as an Anabaptist, like Anabaptists advocated that that's the way the government should work, but they also they weren't the ones doing it. Okay, so they wouldn't be the ones who were taking up arms to, take in the pagans or whatever. But they would say that is something that maybe has to happen and that God has to do, that God uses that. So I think even if you're coming from the Anabaptist viewpoint, you can't be totally activistic. So my friends who are Christians and anarchists, but not Christian anarchists, they are much more optimistic about how Christians could participate in a libertarian society. That, if we had this libertarian society, I could be a private police force. I could be the person who's, out there doing this violence, and be just really participating in it. And I think I would say no, I can try to push the government in the right direction, reminded of what its actual purposes and what God has made it to do. But there's also a certain degree of separation that I have to initiate from that, just because Christ is my king and Christ has said not to take up arms. Christ has said, turn the other cheek. Christ has said, he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. And so there's certain things that I can't do, even if they are legitimate from a natural law perspective for non-Christians to do.
That sounds close to what I, without using these terms, argued in my book Exiles.
Yeah.
There is a strong separation from the church and state. The kingdom of God is a political entity that is, I would say, at odds with all other kingdoms on the earth. So it's kind of an argument against the kind of two kingdoms theory. And yet I do lean more towards prophetic witness, not being like I distinguish between prophetic witness and being a separatist, being, removed from society. I do, while I see some of the logic with the separatist thing, I do think, I just see more scriptural evidence of speaking truth to power and confronting injustice and being a source of good and truth and beauty in the world, which requires more involvement. But this is where and I don't know, I really know where I would totally end up landing on this. Like, does that exclude any kind of Christian involvement in the state? The state's a broad category, and people have said, okay, well, you talking about like the president or the general in the army, or are you talking about the DMV worker? Like,
right.
That's a broad category. And I'm like, oh yeah.
And I mean, among the early Anabaptists, there were some really, there was some variation. So there were some who sort of said, you don't participate in any of that at all.
Right.
But there's one theologian, a guy named Pilgrim Marpeck. And he actually was like an engineer who worked for the local city. And he felt like there was nothing wrong with that he was basically contributing to the local community without actually doing any violence himself. And he felt like that was okay for him to do. Now, if they had told him to take up a sword, that would be a different thing. And so that was where he drew the line. And I'm sort of sympathetic with that. Even though I have my own issues with the way this, government works. And if I had my way, it would, go away in its current state. There's somebody at a Libertarian Christian Institute, a guy named Alex Bernardo. I think he may have interviewed you.
Yeah,
He's
Alex. Yeah.
he's a public school teacher. And I don't think he's a jerk because he's a public school teacher. He has his own viewpoint about, how the education system should work. But I understand he's trying to do a job as best he can. That's not maybe an ideal job. And so, we don't give him a hard time for that. So I find myself a little bit more on that Pilgrim Marpeck side. I think there's a book I wrote some years back called Fight the Powers. And it was like trying to connect, it's actually a biblical theology of political power and its relationship to demonic power. So kind of looking at all the texts in the Bible that sort of connect
Oh,
political
really?
power
Is that
with spiritual power.
Walter Wink? No.
No, I do cite him, but he comes from a much more secular liberal perspective. Do I have it here? The book that I wrote is called Fight the Powers. It's pretty short. Most of my books are pretty short. But it does
you
cite
wrote
him a little
bit.
Saying? Yeah, it's a book I wrote. Yeah. And what I argue.
I thought you were referring to another. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. But one of the things I argue, I'm kind of looking at different models for Christian involvement, which is sort of like, okay, so if we agree with the Bible that there are spiritual powers that are sort of intertwined with the state, how does that shape how we want to be involved with the state? And I kind of put myself at that point somewhere between the Anabaptists, the traditional, the kind of Anabaptists as we see them, fully separatist, and that's the model of prophetic witness. And so if you look at like what Martin Luther King was doing and you look at the civil rights movement in the United States, I think it's fair to say at times, especially looking back now and looking at how it's evolved, it's probably become too intertwined with politics. But if you look at that prophetic witness and what it was able to accomplish, it's hard to argue with what Martin Luther King was doing. But I would put myself kind of between that full-on separatist and prophetic witness viewpoint, I think.
Okay. So Christian anarchists obeys laws of the government. They submit to government authorities. They're not rebelling against laws the ones that don't conflict with the Christian worldview. I mean,
I would say so.
Yeah.
I mean, I have some friends who are kind of more libertarian anarchists who are Christian, but I think, what you see from some people is, well, if the state is illegitimate, then I should just disobey them all the time. And like, I understand the logic of that. But I think that, when you look at Paul seems really concerned that Christians inconvenience themselves and set their rights aside if it means that they get along peacefully with their neighbors, that they don't besmirch the gospel, that they don't, make it look bad and make it seem like it's, like this kind of violent, rebellious thing that's just opposed to any kind of order.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think to be a Christian anarchist and not just an anarchist who's also a Christian, I think means that you actually do take into consideration all of that biblical data, and that also you take that into consideration, that you let that guide you. For me, I try to obey stupid laws, unless I feel like it's really an immoral law, like it expects me to do something that's wrong. So, I'm happy to obey drug laws, even if they weren't on the books. But I'm not going to turn in a neighbor who is a peaceful immigrant. That feels like very different to me. So that's kind of where I would go. That I think, if we're trying to, start crap all the time, I don't think we're really being biblical.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to, especially when the Bible is written all throughout the biblical period in times when the people of God were primarily, often under the power of a really, really corrupt and, according to Paul in the book of Revelation, demonically empowered. So it seems like from a biblical theological perspective, there is that tension of you can name something as empowered by Satan, Revelation 3 or 13, and that we should come out of Babylon, Revelation 18, and yet still live a quiet and subversively quiet, subversively submissive life, where we're not, trying to overthrow. We're still showing honor to Caesar while we're not giving allegiance to Caesar. That kind of tension, as I see it, at least.
Yeah. I think that's a fair way to put it.
Would I and I think there's a lag here. So if it sounds like I'm cutting you off, I'm not trying to.
Sorry.
In the internet. You've listened to my stuff and read some of my, but would I be a Christian anarchist? And I'm not huge into labels. I have friends that say they like the provocative nature of the label. Like it's good to have a label like that because it's disruptive, and that's a good thing. I think there's a place for that. I also think clarity is good too, and
Yeah.
sometimes people won't even listen to what you're saying if they hear a label slapped on you that is, it's just super off-putting or whatever, or they misunderstand it. So
Yeah. I mean, a label is just a word. And I mean, a word is a handle
right.
to help convey meaning. And so
Yeah.
I think, I'm okay with using the word anarchist, but there may be certain contexts in where I wouldn't.
Right.
I think when I think about that kind of web of anarchist terms, anarcho-capitalist, anarcho-communist, anarchist,
Yeah.
voluntarist, I kind of like the word voluntarist because I think it puts the right emphasis where it needs to be, which is that we're trying to build a voluntary society where people are not aggressed upon who are minding their business. So I think that I like that better than starting with like capitalism, even though I believe in capitalism. I just don't really see that as the central idea.
Okay.
What I call
Yeah.
you, so I've been suspicious that you might think of yourself as a Christian anarchist, but I don't know for sure where you are on that journey. So I don't want to speak for you, but I consider
Yeah.
you at least sympathetic and willing to have the conversation.
What would be a certain belief, a political, a certain belief, a certain political theology that would render one basically outside Christian anarchism? Like, are there some key things that they're like, well, if you believe that, then you're not in this realm
Yeah.
of discourse.
So kind of the traditional Christian
I mean,
anarchism.
violence, like
Yeah.
coercion,
Yeah.
coercion through violence. I mean,
I think, the traditional Christian anarchism, not just Christianity plus anarchism, would be violence. And you can define that in different ways. Like, so for example, I don't have a problem with restraining somebody or, holding down my kid so they can get a shot that they might need to get at the doctor's office. But I think, one place we can pretty confidently draw the line is like lethal force, right? So I feel like that's a pretty good thing to at least say, like, that's, I mean, maybe if I find myself in a situation, I don't know what to do in the moment, something happens, there's grace for that. But that's not like something that I have made room for in my theology and in my life. That's not how I'm going to try to approach my problems. Like I said, I've got friends who are, like I said, more on that Christian plus anarchist side. And I think the non-aggression principle is kind of something that they would see as pretty important, at least on that kind of libertarian anarchist side. And then of course you would add to that, maybe however you define Christianity, belief in the major Orthodox creeds or something.
right. Yeah.
So I think it just kind of depends on if you're talking about Christian anarchism or Christian plus anarchism.
What about, okay, let's get practical. Voting. Do Christian anarchists vote?
Many don't. I
Because of their political theology.
Yeah. So, for two reasons. I think one is because if the state is violence, do you participate? Do you want to participate in violence? And the other thing is, if Christ is my king, then why am I voting in another king's election? um, and there's some logic to that. But once again, I think myself in that little bit more of that Pilgrim Marpeck strain, where I could say, like, so for example, man, I'm bringing this up a lot. A few years ago in Ohio, there was a law to make marijuana legal. And I have friends who smoke marijuana. I have people who I care about, people in my family who smoke marijuana. I don't think they should go in jail if they get caught. I think that's horrible. Like, so I was happy to go and vote to try to get that on the Ohio Constitution that marijuana was legal. I don't feel any remorse about that at all. Because I wasn't doing it to perpetuate violence, and I wasn't doing it because I don't think of Christ as my king. I was doing it because I care about my neighbors.
Yeah. That's I'm sympathetic to that. I mean, I lean towards not voting in principle. Hope that's not too of a shock for people. I've talked about this, but I could see the argument of like, okay, so let's just talk, presidential elections. One of these people is going to be there no matter what. Like, it's not like your lack of votes going to de-imperialize the empire. And if there is one potential ruler that is clearly and this is where it gets tricky, because is clearly going to lead to more harm towards other people, then why not cast your vote? Not support, definitely not allegiance, but just say, I'm going to vote in this direction because the other side is so clearly evil. For instance, let's if someone, if you believe, say, abortion is the murder of innocent people, and one candidate is clearly opposing that, one's clearly for it, I could see the logic of saying, okay, empire is empire is empire, but this Caesar is going to kill less or lead to, and I'm tapping into the logic of certain people. I'm not necessarily endorsing this, but like this leader will lessen the killing of innocent civilians. Or if somebody says, I think, certain immigration policies are absolutely inhumane. And like you said, I have neighbors that are going to be deeply affected by this. So out of love for my neighbor, I'm going to vote in another direction. Or I don't know, one that's close on my heart is like, well, the whole, war in Gaza. If there was one candidate who was clearly concerned about that, which neither is, then I could see from my Palestinian brothers and sisters, like, gosh, if this person gets elected, it's going to be worse. It's going to be worse on them. If this person, it's going to alleviate all this suffering. So all that to say, I could see the logic in it. I think for me, there is, I don't know. Voting is complex. I mean, is it actually offering support? And I love what what you said about the political kingship of Christ means something. And I voted for he won the election when he walked out of the grave, right? And I also, on a practical level, I imagine a scenario where in our American context, that the evangelical Christian church didn't vote so that these Caesars would stop pandering to the evangelical church and doing whatever they can to win their allegiance. And I'm like, well, what if they knew we didn't vote for anybody? I think that there would be a much clearer separation between church and state. It's theoretical. It's not a hill I would die on, but yeah, just some thoughts,
I think that there's room for conscience. Like, I mean, I think that's kind of my thing. Like, I have a libertarian friend who voted for Trump because in the end he thought that maybe he would get some really good libertarian policies. That's not a decision I felt comfortable making. Now if Hitler had risen from the grave and got himself on a third party ballot and was maybe going to win against Donald Trump, it'd be really hard not to vote for Donald Trump. But just generally speaking, I think, when you're comparing the class of people that we're talking about with the major parties, the distinctions are not, I think, really significant enough for what I think Christians and libertarians should be concerned about. So it's hard for me to make that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I think American politics is like the entertainment wing of the military industrial complex. So I think part of it is like, I don't know, peek behind the curtain, you guys, like, you're kind of being had a little bit with a lot of this stuff.
If I didn't think you were an anarchist before, I think so now because you just said that.
Well, that might be the intertwining of war profiteering and how that has embedded its tentacles into so many other aspects of the country, and that the country, I think America is largely an oligarchy, not a like a democracy or something. So part of it is just my not even my political theology, but just politics in general. I'm kind of like, you peek behind the system a little bit and you see they're kind of working for the same corporation.
It's just observational.
Like there's a video clip, and this is just one of thousands of examples you can give, but like it was Trump and Obama kind of like just recently, like a couple weeks ago, like sitting together, whispering, laughing, kind of like they even said, I think there's a lip reader saying, hey, we should meet up. We got to talk about something, and people were like, how are they chummy? I'm like, come on, dude, they're I'm pretty convinced that they're kind of hanging out at night over drinks and like maybe not that much, but anyway, we kind of got off track. What okay, in the few minutes we have remaining, what would be the strongest pushbacks to your view as an anarchist Anabaptist? What are some things you're like, not sure I'd be able to respond super convincingly to this counter argument.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, so yeah, you're going to get different pushback from different people, right? So, secular libertarians, for example, they're not going to want to really consider Anabaptism because it's Christian and it's radical, and Anabaptists seem weird. Most intellectuals don't make a habit of saying, I wonder what the Amish and Mennonites might have to contribute to my political philosophy. But I think Christian libertarians, I mean, like I talked about the difference between a Christian anarchist and a Christian who's an anarchist. They're going to, I think, really be suspicious of the nonviolent piece. And that's partly because there is, at least on paper, a tension, because the non-aggression principle is not completely nonviolent. It's not pacifistic. And so they'd say, well, you're proposing pacifism. And, I as a libertarian believe in the non-aggression principle. I mean, my answer to that is that they apply to different realms, different domains, different people, honestly. So Christians, I think, we can talk about rights and natural rights and all these things, but we also have to take into account that Christ told us to set aside our rights. So they're there, but if we're followers of Jesus, we're called to a different standard than non-Christians are. So I think, those are going to be, I think, that the big pieces of pushback. I think coming from maybe Anabaptists, especially who are a little bit more progressive, they're not going to like some of the things I said about free markets. But I also deal with that in the book, and I think I deal with it pretty well. But we're running out of time, so I won't go into too much detail there. But I think if you believe in nonviolence, I don't see why you would support a kind of a big violent government, trying to regulate everything that's going on in the market. That's maybe kind of the short answer, but
yeah, that's good. Well, Cody, the book is really good. Again, I would highly encourage people to check it out. If anything, it's really short and easy to read. I don't know how many. It's like 120, 140, but it's not. It's not like a dense text. Like you can read it in a few hours, really. And I'm actually a slow reader, and it's so clear. This is what I love. It's so you interact with a lot of thinkers and stuff, but I love how you organize even like anarcho-communism and capitalism, or what? Yeah, those categories, and you break down different categories and kind of situate kind of where you would fit and why. And it's really helpful. It's not like something I found it helpful because it's not like you're telling everybody this is what you must believe and you're an idiot if you don't. It's kind of like you're just laying out these two traditions, anarchism and Anabaptism, and showing a possible way in which they can converge. That might be the summary of your book. I mean,
that's great. No, and I'm so glad to hear that too. I mean, I tend to write short because I hate reading books that are longer than they need to be. I mean, if it needs to be long, fine, but if it doesn't, don't do that. But also that it was clear and concise. That's really encouraging to hear. So that's exactly what I'm hoping to do. So there's the main chapter, or the main essay of the book, the longest one is called The Anarchist Anabaptist, but then I have sort of other chapters as well that connect or coincide with that. One that I think some of your viewers and listeners might find interesting is called the American Sacrament that Denies Allegiance to Christ. And it goes into that history of the word sacramentum and where it comes from and how we would, I think, apply it as Christians to violence, believe it or not.
Yeah. Good. If anybody wants to get a hold of you, can they reach out to you, or do you have a website or something?
Yeah. So I'm doing most of my work today is done through libertarianchristians.com. I also have a website that you can go to where that's kind of a place where it's kind of my catch-all, where I'll kind of a clearinghouse, I guess. Anything I'm on or anything I do, I'll post there. And that's cantusfirmus.com, cantus-firmus.com. But libertarianchristians.com is easier to remember. And they're also putting out this book. So
awesome. Well, thanks for being on the Theology Raw, Cody. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Preston. It's really been exciting to be here.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.